Hello and welcome back to Get Up and Game. My name is Josh, and after a couple weeks off to handle some things, I am very happy to be back making videos. And what a video to come back to. Yesterday, they dropped the rules reference version 1.5 on us, something we've been clamoring for a long time. And it is a doozy. There is a lot to go through here, and I'm going to go through all of it. Though I'm going to hit the major highlights first, so the things you're probably most curious about, we're going to dive in first, and then I'm going to go through sort of just point by point. We're going to, everything that's red, everything that's new, we're going to talk about it at least quickly, mention what everything is new for it. Now, a couple things I want to say before we dive into this. I've seen some concern out there that there are a lot of new rules. There is a lot to take in, and this is maybe a little much. And I want to encourage you that this is actually mostly just clarifications. If you're somebody who keeps up with the Hall of Heroes rulings where they answer questions that people send in, much of this will actually be very familiar to you. Now, I know the vast majority of you are likely not people who keep up with that stuff, and you shouldn't have to, certainly. So this might feel like a lot, but they haven't really changed very many rules. It's more they've just made a lot of things much more clear. So if this feels like a lot, I want to assure you that it's actually fantastic. I think this is a great document. It's very, very easy to read. That's the strength of this here, is it's just all greatly expanded. When we go into some of the sections, everything is so step by step and laid out that if you have a rules question, this rules reference is probably going to answer it for you, and you won't need to go searching for things like Hall of Heroes to find the answers, because most of the common rules questions I can think of were all pretty well laid out here. There are still a couple things not 100% sure about. I'm sure we'll get some clarifications, and I might miss a few things as I'm going through this because I don't want to spend too long talking about it, but there is a lot here. So that's the first thing. If it feels like that this is a lot, hopefully as we go through it, you'll see that it isn't quite as much as maybe it seemed with the explosion of discussion that took place yesterday on all the Discords and social media platforms, I'm sure. And the other thing is, you don't need to know all of this. One thing I want to put out right at the beginning of this is I'm going to go through all of it, but it's certainly not that you need to memorize all these changes or know about all these things up front. It's more that you're going to be able to become familiar with the rules simply by looking things up, because they're so well laid out. You'll be able to find the answers. So it's more about just knowing that the questions that you have are going to be answered in this document. And so we're going to go through it. Like I said, I want to hit the highlights first, the biggest things that they changed or clarified, so that you know right up front. And the first one that I'm so very excited about is that they have greatly clarified and expanded the rules for the permanent keyword. A card with the permanent keyword cannot be defeated, leave play, or have any part of its text box blanked except by card abilities in the same set. Now, let's talk about a little bit about what that means. So when it says cannot be defeated, that helps clarify things like if there are side schemes in play. Some scenarios have a side scheme that says permanent. And, the question would be, if you remove the threat, is that considered to be defeated? We now know that it can't be. So like Phoenix's Consume the World side scheme, even if you remove all the threat, it is not considered defeated. So that's nice to know. Permanent cards are set aside at the start of step 1 of setup. That right there, if that was all they changed, I think we'd all be happy. So Wolverine's claws are set aside at the beginning of setup. Spectrum's energy forms, Visions, and Shadowcat's, tangible, solid stuff set aside at the beginning. No more wondering when they're supposed to come out of the deck. Do they count towards the deck size? Does Spectrum only need to have 37 cards in her deck? They don't count toward the minimum or maximum hand size, which is the next bullet point, and they come out at the beginning of setup. So if it's a permanent card, it can't be captured by Ultron or the Collector or anything like that. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. At step 1, they are simply set aside. Permanent cards are not valid targets for card effects that would cause the permanent card to leave play. If a permanent card would be discarded by such an effect, that effect instead targets the non-permanent card that fits the criteria. So we know everything we need to know about permanent. If a player is eliminated from the game while a permanent card they do not own is in their play area, place that permanent card in its owner's discard pile. So it's permanent till the person dies. Now, one other thing that's interesting, have any part of its text box blanked except by card abilities in the same set. So the Vivian ally, the basic one, cannot blank something as, say, the Infinity Gauntlet, because it is permanent and she is not in the same set. So there might be cards within, say, a modular encounter set or a villain scenario that have permanent printed on them. And then there might be other cards that can cause them to leave play. For example, I know I mentioned villain, but with Hero Spectrum, her energy forms are permanent. And then it's like, well, why can we flip them down? They're leaving play. Well, it's because it's an effect from the same set. So those rules still apply. So, but the biggest thing here with permanent is that Wolverine's claws work the way they're intended. And we'll look at the errata here in a little bit, but his alter ego text was errated to go along with these rules. So it's just very, very nice. That's one of the biggest questions I think we always have, especially when a new hero comes out with a card like this, like Vision or Shadowcat or Wolverine. We don't know exactly how it's meant to be played, and it can be a little bit frustrating. So that's one of the big ones. Kind of going along with that, I want to talk about the revised setup order. So if you go to the appendix 2 towards the back, it tells you, the order of how to set everything up. And there were some clarifications made here, which are so very nice. So here at step 1, you select your identities and everybody selects an identity. You start with alter ego side face up. It doesn't say it here, and I kind of wish it did, but this is also where you set aside your permanent cards. It's step 1. And then everything's pretty much the same until we get to step 10, where you create the encounter deck. You shuffle the encounter sets listed together with the obligation cards set aside during setup step 4 to create the encounter deck. So before there was some wonkiness about you set the cards aside and then when do you shuffle them together and all that. You just shuffle them all together at the same time, and you include the obligation in the initial setup of the encounter deck. That used to be a separate step where the obligation was shuffled in later, and it was just kind of a hassle. And it was sort of meant to prevent the obligation from being discarded to many setup abilities. And I guess they've just decided it's not worth having a whole extra step in setup just to avoid that possibility. It's really not that big of a deal if an obligation gets discarded or dealt out as an encounter card to start the game. So now the obligation starts right in the encounter deck. You don't have to do a separate step for that. And then we get some clarification on when things happen. Step 11, put setup cards into play. Search each deck and the set aside area for any cards with a setup keyword and put them into play. That's usually going to be things with campaign cards that might have some setup. Like with Rise of the Red Skull, you might have some special cards that have the setup keyword. This is when you would put those into play. This is referring to the keyword printed on cards, not the setup text on the alter ego of certain heroes. So we'll definitely see that here in a minute. And then we get this much better expanded. Step 12, resolve scenario setup and when revealed abilities. Resolve any setup instructions on main scheme card 1A. Then it tells you to flip the main scheme card to side 1B and resolve any when revealed abilities on that side. And then resolve any when revealed abilities on the villain. Before, we were never sure of when the villain was meant to be resolved. There was no rule for it. I think many of us were just doing the scheme first and then the villain, but now we know for sure. Like I said, everything is very clearly laid out, bullet point from bullet point. And then here at step 13 is the campaign setup. Now they've included that as part of the general setup. If you're playing campaign, you know that this is when you'll go into your campaign booklet and you'll follow all the steps in that book as far as, where you are in the campaign and all the things need to be shuffled in or put into play, things like that. You do that before you then do your own stuff where you draw your cards, you do your mulligan, and then the last step is still to do your character setup abilities, like Black Panther gets to go get an upgrade, or Captain America goes and finds his shield, things like that. This is when you would do that, is still the last step. So really, it's just nice that the obligation is just shuffled in. We don't have to worry about keeping it out and then shuffling it in later. And we know what order to do the main scheme setup and then the villain setup. So that is nice as well. Now, another very nice chart we have is if you look in the ability section, pretty much right at the beginning of the glossary, if we scroll down, you're going to see that there is a timing chart that we finally know exactly what order everything is supposed to take place in. So here they've added this timing section. Some abilities have timing priority over other abilities. In order, the timing priority of abilities with the same triggering condition, and that of course is important. Everything happens at a certain time, and if multiple things happen at the same time, now we know what order to trigger those in. So the first thing is always constant abilities, keywords, and then any of the icons that are often found on like side schemes and maybe some other cards in play. So those always come first. So constant abilities are pretty much going to be text printed on, say the villain might have a special rule that's just always in effect if it doesn't have any kind of timing wording like interrupt or response or anything like that. If it's just a sentence that says this villain does this, that's a constant ability that's always on and that is always happening. Or like Star-Lord's ability to where every ally that comes into play under his control is a guardian. That is a constant ability. So the moment they enter play before anything else can happen, they are considered a guardian because that's a constant ability that happens immediately. And any kind of keywords like quick strike or retaliate, steady, there's a lot, and we have a nice list of all of them now. Those take priority over other things. And then number 2 is status cards. This is a big one. Now, this is how it's been for a long time, but it's still just good to know and have it laid out that the status cards, stun, confuse, and tough, have timing priority over pretty much everything else that you would want to do. And kind of the big one that throws people off is with tough, and there's another section for it later, but the tough is going to happen before you can do any kind of damage prevention effect. So if you've got damage incoming and you want to play an interrupt or response, like something like a sidestep, or using Vision's intangible ability to prevent damage from minions, if you have a tough, the tough is going to get there before your ability can react to it. So you're going to lose tough to the damage before you can potentially prevent it, simply because the status cards have a higher timing. And while that can be a little bit unfortunate when it comes to tough sometimes it's a good thing. With Groot, you're going to lose the tough before you lose any growth counters, because that is a forced response to losing growth, to taking damage. So it's nice for Groot, but for somebody like Colossus, maybe it would have been nice if you could use a sidestep to keep your tough, but that's just how it works. But it needs to be consistent across the board, because where it would really mess things up would be with like stun and confuse. If you could interact with the villain with an interrupt, or if the villain had a forced interrupt that took place before the stunned could trigger, that would really muck things up. So it's just better just to know that stun and confuse and tough happen pretty early in the timing priority. And then you get to the forced interrupt abilities. A lot of villains have abilities that are forced interrupts. That's when those trigger. And then the regular interrupts, which is often what you'll be doing, the optional interrupt. And then we have a section for boost, when defeated, and when revealed abilities. So it's nice to know exactly when those take place in the timing priority. And then forced responsibilities, and then consequential damage is always the last thing that happens. So if you have an ally that has a forced response or responsibility, those are going to take place first. And then the consequential damage happens last. So just like we've always had with Tigra, her ability to heal after she has defeated a minion, she'll heal first if she has any damage on her. And then the last thing that will happen is she will take consequential damage. So nothing really new here. Again, it's just really nice to have it laid out so clearly. And again, that's the big takeaway from the whole thing. Most of it isn't new. It's just very clearly laid out. Now, one thing that is kind of new is we have this whole new section on target. One thing that they have changed, and it feels like a significant change, and to some degree it is, but in other degrees it's not, is instead of that whole phrase we used to have to deal with was, does this action change the game state? That was a big rule for the game. You couldn't do something if it didn't change the game state. But that's a very nebulous phrase. And there were still a lot of questions about what exactly does that mean to change the game state. If I play a card that maybe doesn't have an effect on the board in any way, but I paid resources and now I don't have the card in my hand anymore, so the game state changed. Well, some things applied and some things didn't. So they've just done away with that altogether. There's no more, does this change the game state? Instead, you have to determine if there's a valid target. In order to take any kind of action, there has to be a valid target. So we're just going to read through this section step by step. Target. If a game function or card ability is directed toward a game element, which game element is another new term that there's a whole section for, such as an attack that deals damage to an enemy, that game element becomes the target of that function or ability for the duration of that function's or ability's resolution. Basically, just if you're doing something, there's a target. There has to be a target for it. Examples of targets include, but are not limited to, the villain, a minion, an enemy, a scheme, a hero, an ally, a character, a player, you, a card. Okay, already I'm just going to tell you, this sounds like a lot. This is, everything still pretty much works the way it always did, the way you expect it to. It's just made more clear. Instead of this nebulous phrase, change the game state, we just know we have to determine a target. If an ability specifies one or more targets, that ability can only be initiated if it has at least one valid target. For example, an ability that says deal 5 damage to a minion cannot be initiated if there are no minions in play. So you can't play Relentless Assault to attack a minion if there are no minions in play. So you can't just choose to play it because you want to play an aggression card that maybe triggers something else. There needs to be a target. If an ability specifies one or more targets, that ability can only be initiated if it has at least one valid target. So if you have an ability that wants to target a whole bunch of things, as long as there's at least one, you can still play it. The phrase choose a game element indicates that one or more targets must be selected in order for an ability to initiate. So you're going to see, you choose a minion in play, choose a scheme, whatever. And so you just know that that's going to be your target. A target is not valid for an ability if no part of that ability can affect that target. So a very easy example is with the Get Ready event from Leadership, 0 cost, ready an ally. If the ally is not exhausted, then you can't choose to play that card because it can't affect that target. It can't be readied, so it can't be targeted. So again, this is all stuff that makes sense. It works the way you think it probably should work. It's just very clearly laid out. The cost of an ability is not considered when determining if that ability can affect a target. So this is talking about sometimes cards have an extra cost, like What Doesn't Kill Me also heals you for 2. Now, maybe that could affect you if you are the target, because maybe you need to heal for 2. But since that's part of the cost, that's not determining the target. The target is for the ability of the card, which in the case of What Doesn't Kill Me would be ready your hero. If your hero is not exhausted, you can't choose to play that card just to heal 2 because you are not a valid target for the effect. You're not a valid target for the ability. The ability of the card isn't heal 2 and ready. The ability of the card is just to ready. The healing 2 is part of the cost, and that is not factored in when determining the target. So basically, you have to pay all your costs and then look at what the effect would be. And if the effect wouldn't change anything or doesn't make a valid target, we can't use that doesn't change things jargon anymore, then you can't play it. But if an ability has multiple effects on its target, the target is valid if at least one of those effects can affect that target. This goes back to the whole do as much as you can thing. So, you can't use Get Ready on an ally that is not exhausted because the only effect of Get Ready is to ready that ally and it's not exhausted. So it's not a valid target. But you could play Reboot on, say, the Vivian ally from the Vision Pack, even if she were ready, but if she had damage on her, because Reboot says to heal 1 damage from an android ally, ready that ally. So there are 2 effects there, and as long as one of those effects can take place, then it becomes a valid target. So even if Vivian is ready, but she has damage on her, you could still play the Reboot. Again, same as it's always been. You do as much as you can, but you need to be able to do at least some of it. A target is not valid for an ability if that ability would cause the target to perform a game function another ability says the target cannot perform. For example, a character with an attachment that says attached character cannot ready is not a valid target. So it's just really clearly laying out everything that determines whether or not something is a valid target. Target that cannot be attacked is not a valid target for an attack labeled ability. A target that cannot be thwarted is not a valid target for a thwart labeled ability. Just heading off any kinds of weird rules that people might come up with, but these aren't things you would likely be trying to do anyway. So if it seems like a lot of rules, it's really just the same thing it's always been. An ability that targets every game element of a specific type, for example, each enemy, can be initiated as long as at least one of those game elements is a valid target. That ability does not resolve against any of those game elements that is not a valid target. So the way this one works is if we go down to, there's a question about Dive Bomb right here. Can I play Dive Bomb if I'm engaged with a minion with a guard keyword? If so, how would it resolve? So, Dive Bomb is an attack, and if there's a guard in play, you would think you wouldn't be able to play it. But as long as you can resolve some of it, you can still play it. So it says yes. Abilities are resolved 1 sentence at a time, so deal 7 damage to an enemy would resolve first. If that damage defeated the guard minion, the second effect, deal 1 damage to each other enemy, would deal 1 damage to the villain. So if you defeat the guard, then now you're available to attack the villain because these are separate sentences. So you're doing the first thing first, deal 7 damage to an enemy, and then period, and then move on to the next sentence, deal 1 damage to each other enemy. So if you defeat the guard, then you can go ahead and deal 1 damage to the villain. However, if the first sentence did not defeat the guard minion, if you chose to hit something else with it, which it could not have been the villain because there is a guard minion in play, the second sentence would deal 1 damage to each enemy other than the villain, and the enemy dealt damage by the first sentence. So you can still play Dive Bomb, even if there's a guard enemy in play. And even if you don't kill the guard, it just doesn't damage the villain. I thought that one was interesting. I wouldn't have thought that that's how that worked, but it's all about determining valid targets. And the villain would not be a valid target if there was a guard in play, but you can still target everything else. So just getting back to the target rules here. So again, an ability that targets every game element of a specific type can be initiated as long as at least one of those game elements is a valid target. Does not resolve against any of those game. Okay, so that's what we just talked about with Dive Bomb. And if we scroll back up, and that also applies to, Dive Bomb is just one example of something that hits a whole bunch of different stuff. But anything that says, remove threat from every scheme in play. Well, if there's a crisis, you could remove threat from every other scheme, just not the main scheme. Which is, in fact, the example. And an effect that refers to a future target, i.e. the next card you play, does not require a target to initiate. So we just get some very clearly laid out rules about what is an available target, or what is a valid target, I should say. That's the terminology they're using. And so that's when it's time to determine to play a card. Let me find that. So this is the same rules as it always has been with initiating abilities. When a player wishes to play a card or initiate a triggered ability, you must first declare your intent. Then we have to determine if there's a target. Check play restrictions. Can the card be played or the ability initiated at this time? There's nothing preventing you. And then if the card or ability specifies one or more targets, check that it has at least one valid target. So this is the same as it's always been. It's just instead of checking to see if it's going to change the game state, you're determining if there's a target. It's just a cleaner, more specific way to look at it rather than some of the nebulous things that were coming up before. Otherwise, that all works the same. So we got to get used to this target terminology instead of changing the game state. Now, on that note, there is one significant exception to choosing a valid target. If we go into the rules for stun, and it's going to say the same thing in confused, we're going to talk about this real quick. Stun is a status that prevents a character from dealing damage with its next attack. And it goes on to say everything you already know about stunned, though it does clarify a character with a steady keyword is stunned only if it has 2 stunned status cards. So if there is an effect that's referring to a stunned character, if that character is steady and they have 1 stun on them, they are not considered stunned. They're only considered stunned if they're in fact going to be, missing their next attack because they were fully stunned. But here we see a stunned character can attempt to attack or use an attack ability even if there are no enemies that can be attacked. So this is an exception to the rule that says there has to be a valid target. If you are stunned or confused, even if there is no target, you can still attempt to, say, thwart a scheme to clear your confuse or attack the villain to clear your stun, even if, say you're playing Sinister Six and there are no villains in play at the time, because that can definitely happen, but you happen to be stunned somehow, you can still exhaust just to attack nothing, just to clear the stun. So this is the one exception to the valid targets rule. And I think thematically it's just meant to represent that just because there's, nothing in play to do, there's no reason why your character can't just, shake off your stun or shake off your confuse. You don't have to actually have somebody to attempt to punch to clear your stun. You could just, shake your head or whatever. That's how I see it thematically. But yeah, so you can, and it just says attempt to attack or use an attack ability. So near as I can tell, and I think we're looking for some clarification on this, but near as I can tell, you could even play an event that says like Relentless Assault. If you are stunned and there are no minions in play, I think you can still play it to clear your stun. I think that's kind of weird because Relentless Assault requires a minion to be played, but that's what it says. Can attempt to attack or use an attack ability even if there are no enemies that can be attacked. Now, keep an eye out for clarification on this, because this is one thing I'm not 100% sure of exactly what all the ramifications of this are, but either way, I would say at the very least, you can definitely exhaust to attack or exhaust to thwart to clear a stun or confuse, even if there's no valid targets. And we know from a rules question about Nebula's Cutthroat Ambition card that says remove 3 threat from a scheme, when her turn starts, the way Nebula's techniques work. And they answered and said that even if there's no threat to remove and you're confused, you can still resolve that card to clear your confuse. So you can still play events or trigger other kinds of abilities, even if there are no valid targets, but only if it's to clear a status. So that's kind of an exception. If you're not stunned or confused, you absolutely have to have a valid target. But if you are stunned or confused, you don't. You are allowed to clear a status. And I think that was just meant to prevent the players from falling into some sort of unfortunate trap where you happen to have this status effect on you and there's just no way to remove it because there's no valid targets. They didn't really want there to be that situation. Now that's going to be incredibly rare. There's probably going to be threats somewhere to remove. There's probably going to be an enemy to attack, but there is this provision, and it's worth noting, partially because it's a little weird, but it makes sense, and partially because it is located here in the rules for stun and confuse, but it is not located in the rules for initiating abilities or for determining valid targets. And I wish it was also included in those places because it seems like a decently big enough exception that it could have been called out in multiple places. But I'm calling it out here. So if you watch this video, you will know that if you're stunned or confused, you will always be able to clear those statuses, even if there are no targets. Now, there are two more major sections I want to highlight, and then we're just going to go through the things step by step. One is the rules for defending and defense, which are always a little bit tricky in this game. They have made some clarifications and maybe some changes. There were some things that I thought that were already the way they worked, but either way, we know for sure now that they are listed here. So we're just going to go through this. During an enemy attack, a player may defend against an attack using cards they control. Only one player at a time can defend against an enemy attack while player is defending. No other player can defend. So we already know that that's how that works. There can only be one defender. A hero can use their basic defense power to defend against an enemy attack. A hero must exhaust. So that's just how all that works. While a hero is defending against an attack, no other friendly character can defend against that attack. When a card ability says to declare a hero the defender of an attack, that hero is considered to be making a basic defense. And what that means is they're using their defense stat, so they would reduce the damage by their defense. And as far as I know, the only card that currently says that is Shield Maiden from Valkyrie, where it says to declare her as the defender, and then she gets +2 DEF for her defense. But it's very likely they could print, say, some protection cards in the future, and I hope they do, that say to declare your hero as the defender for an attack without exhausting them, because that would be awesome. If you could say declare Spider-Man as the defender for an attack, you'd still get his 3 defense, but then he gets to stay ready to punch or thwart later. So I really, really hope we do see cards like that. But either way, it's just sort of adding that terminology, declare a hero the defender of an attack. You are considered to be defending for anything that cares about defending. And also you would get to use your defense to reduce the incoming damage. An ally can exhaust to defend against an enemy attack. Damage from the attack is dealt to that ally. While an ally is defending against an attack, no other friendly character. So again, just explaining how the rules work. You can defend with an ally. Nobody else can defend. When a card ability says to declare an ally the defender of an attack, that ally becomes the defender of the attack. So we have seen, I believe, the Mutant Protectors card. That's what that says. It puts an ally into play, and then they are declared the defender. So now we're going to start getting to some things that might be a little bit different or new. When a player initiates a triggered ability labeled as a defense, such as Hero Interrupt Defense, during an enemy attack, that player's identity becomes the defender and is considered to have defended the attack if there is not already a defender. So that's the situation where, Rhino attacks you and you play a sidestep to prevent the damage. That sidestep has the defense designator. So that means that you are considered to have defended for effects like unflappable, hard to ignore, anything that says after you defend, do such and such. And again, that's not new. That's how that always was. The player's identity is considered to be the defender as soon as the defense labeled ability begins resolving. Abilities that trigger when your hero defends against an attack can be triggered when resolving a defense labeled ability. Playing a defense labeled ability is not a basic defense and does not cause a hero to reduce the amount of damage dealt by that hero's defense. So this is all just very clear. Unless specified by the ability's text, a hero does not exhaust when using a defense labeled ability. The defending player may resolve any number of defense abilities during an enemy attack. So you could play multiple sidesteps if you needed to, or desperate defenses if you wanted to. So, get the extra damage prevention or the higher defense. You're allowed to play multiples. Once a player resolves a defense ability during an enemy attack, no other player can resolve defense abilities for that same attack. So once one person has been declared the defender, nobody else is allowed to jump in and do anything. So that one's kind of important because say I exhaust to defend, and then after the boost card is revealed, somebody else wants to play preemptive strike to cancel the boost icons and deal damage back to the villain. They're not allowed to because I'm already the defender. So nobody else is allowed to play defense anything at that point. Defense labeled abilities can be played during an attack by a player whose ally is defending that attack. In that case, the player's identity does not become the defender. So this is a little bit new, or maybe we just weren't sure if we could do this or not. Say I'm defending with my ally, I'm still allowed to play Defiance to cancel the boost effect, or to discard the boost card, even though I'm not the defender, but I don't become the defender. So that's basically what that's for. You can block with your ally, and then you can still play that preemptive strike, or you can still play that Defiance or whatever it is. But it's only by the player whose ally is defending. Somebody else still can't jump in and do that. So if I'm defending with my ally, I'm allowed to play defense events. But it doesn't change who the defender is. That's just sort of a special exception. And that mostly has to do, again, with just a couple protection cards and maybe some hero defense cards. A player can trigger abilities labeled as a defense outside of an attack if the ability's triggering condition is met. When triggered this way, the player's identity is not considered to have defended an attack. So this is where, say you're taking some indirect damage from a non-attack source, like say if you're playing Risky Business and you flip Norman to the Green Goblin side and then he deals a bunch of indirect damage to you, you are allowed to play a sidestep to prevent 3 of that damage. Even though it has the defense designator, it's okay to play that outside of an attack. It's not required to be an attack in order to play that card, or Ms. Marvel's Wiggle Room, or anything else that simply prevents damage. As long as the triggering condition is met, which in this case is simply taking damage, it doesn't say from an attack. If it just says taking damage, you are still allowed to play that. I'll be honest, I thought that's how it already worked, because that's definitely how I've been playing it. And I know this rule is kind of flip-flopped a little bit from some of the earlier rules references, but either way, in the current rules as it stands now, you are allowed to play defense events, even if it's not an attack, as long as the triggering condition is still true. But it doesn't suddenly make you the defender. Like, you can't prevent all the damage from that Risky Business with a sidestep and then say trigger an unflappable to draw a card, because that wasn't, you didn't defend. You simply did the damage prevention part of that card. So maybe a little strange or not, but either way, that's how that works. If a player defends against an enemy attack that targets a different player, either by defending with a character they control or by resolving a defense ability, the defending player becomes the new target of that attack. So that's how that's always worked. If Rhino attacks my friend and then I exhaust my hero, or I play a preemptive strike to block the boost icons and they hadn't already declared themselves as a defender, if they haven't defended yet, at some point during the attack, you can jump in. But if you do, you become the new target for that attack. Now, there's a couple things here that are a little bit interesting. Any triggered effects that resolved before the defending player was declared that refer to you still refer to the player who was attacked originally. And I think the main place that this might come into play is basically any villain that has any kind of interrupt. You know, when the villain attacks you, such and such happens. Like with Ultron, one of the later versions has a text that says, when he attacks you, he gets +1 for each drone enemy and engaged with you. That happens before, any blockers could have been declared, because that's an interrupt to when they initiated that attack. So that is going to be referring to who he's attacking in that moment, which, is the person he is attacking then, regardless of who jumps in and defends later. So that is going to continue to be true regardless of who defends. Any triggered effects that resolved before the defending player was declared that refer to you still refer to the player who was attacked originally. So even if I jump in and defend, that kind of text, we're going to be looking at the original target. Any constant or boost abilities that refer to you refer to the defending player, because those things tend to take place after a blocker has been declared. So now that's, you have become the new target of the attack. So those things refer to you. So some of this stuff is, going to be very rare, but when it does come up, we have rules for it that are very clearly laid out. If no character is used to defend against an enemy attack, that attack is considered undefended. Additionally, if a defending ally is defeated before damage from the attack is dealt, the attack is considered undefended. So this is all the same as it's always been. Abilities that trigger after a character defends an attack resolve after that attack ends. So this is just kind of clearly laying out the timing of this. So if a character defends and then have some sort of ability that says after they defend against an attack, that's after the attack ends, meaning after the damage has been dealt. If an effect causes a defended attack to end before fully resolving, the attack is still considered to have been defended. So this has to do with things like Powerful Punch. If you were able to play those cards and you defeated, say, a minion that was attacking you, and you were, Powerful Punch would make you the defender, or the attack is still considered to have been defended, even if you kill the minion before it finishes its attack. And then finally, if an ability triggers after a character uses a basic power, that ability triggers after an attack in which a character made a basic defense resolves. Again, just explaining the timing of these things. The ability triggers after a character uses a basic power. So you think of like Ghost Spider. She's allowed to play her special events like the Phantom Flip and the Ghost Kick after she uses a basic power. The ability triggers after an attack in which a character made a basic defense resolves, meaning after the damage has been dealt. I've definitely seen people use some of Ghost Spider's effects, immediately they exhaust to defend and they immediately play a Ghost Kick, but it says after you use your basic power, meaning in this case, if you're defending, that means after the defense has fully resolved. And it's just nice that we have the timing of all these things fully laid out. Most of the defense is the same. The thing where you are allowed to play defense labeled events, even if it's not an attack. Again, I thought this how it already worked, but either way, it is for sure how it works now. And you are allowed to play defense events when you're defending with an ally. Again, you could use a Defiance to discard the boost card, even if your ally is defending, and it doesn't make you the defender. So just giving you a little bit more freedom to do fun things, even though the defense rules about there only being one defender at a time can be a little tricky because those cards do have the defense label, which should make you the defender, but they're making a couple exceptions so that you can do some more fun things with that. And then the last section I want to look at is there are some new errata. So some cards have had their text altered. In this case, in the core set, Superhuman Law Division is no longer a thwart ability. So if you exhaust Superhuman Law Division and spend a mental resource to remove 2 threat from a scheme, it is not considered a thwart for any other effects that interact with thwarting, or you couldn't use that to clear a confuse. So that's mainly what that is. MODOK gets his periods that he's supposed to have. It's kind of funny they went to the trouble to clear that up. There's some campaign instructions set up with the collector, so just be sure to check that if you're playing the collector in campaign mode. Some of the big ones here. Cosmo should read, interrupt when Cosmo attacks or thwarts, name a card type, then discard the top card of a player deck or the encounter deck. And then his text goes on to do what it normally does. In this case, it's simply you can't target, Red Skull's Side Scheme deck or Doctor Strange's Invocation deck, the Infinity Stone deck. It's only player decks or the encounter deck, which is probably how it was always intended to be played. But he's become very abusable because there are some decks that are easy to target, and you can no longer do that with him. There are some clarifications with the Mad Titan Shadow 2 main schemes paragraph. That's not that interesting. The Infinity Gauntlet has added the text, after attached villain activates against you, resolve the special ability of each Infinity Stone in play. So whoever say Thanos ends up attacking, say somebody else jumps in the way of the attack and they become the new defender, then they are the one who the Infinity Gauntlet resolves against. I think that's how we always assumed it was meant to be played, but they went ahead and added the text against you so that we know for sure that it's whoever he activated against. Of course, Cosmo's in there twice because we have 2 copies of him. War Machine finally got his limit once per phase on his alter ego ability. The Aragorn change on the Valkyrie changed you get +4 hit points instead of Valkyrie gets +4 hit points. Not sure why that's necessary unless they're afraid you thought maybe it would refer to the ally Valkyrie. Shield Maiden gets the defense trait. So now when you play it and it says, with the enemy with the death glow attached to attacks, declare Valkyrie the defender without exhausting her. She has +2 defense for this attack. This wasn't considered a defense event because it didn't have that designator. Though, again, the fact that it said to declare the Valkyrie the defender, I think we assumed you would still be allowed to trigger defense abilities off of that because it did say to make her the defender, which means she would be defending. But either way, now it has that defense trait for sure, so we don't have to wonder. So you can play that and trigger things like Unflappable. You can recur that card with like Jocasta. So that is just really nice to have that clarified. To make Valkyrie better? Well, some people seem to think so. I don't know. Machine Man got the text that specifies that when you use resources to pump them up, they don't last forever. It is just for that use. Again, I think we had assumed that, but it is nice to know for sure. We kind of get some explanations about how some of the scenarios work in the Sinister Motives. If you want to look at those, Ms. Marvel has been changed in the Nova Signature Ally. After you play an event, exhaust Ms. Marvel and deal 1 damage to her. Return that event to your hand from your discard pile. And they clarify that it's coming from the discard pile specifically because the Go for Champions card here got the text remove Go for Champions from the game as a cost, and then each champion character in play cannot take damage to the end of the round. So now when you play Go for Champions, it's going to be removed from the game. So Ms. Marvel can't recur it because it won't be in your discard pile. It'll be removed from the game. So those two kind of work in tandem. And if there were any other events that get removed from the game when you play them, she wouldn't be able to return it from your discard pile. Or if there was another effect that, if you played an event and it got tucked away somewhere for some reason and it didn't go to your discard pile, she wouldn't be able to recur it for that reason either. Colossus's Steel Fist got fixed. Deal 5 damage to an enemy is no longer a cost. It's simply part of the effect of the card. And then it says you may discard a tough status card from your hero to stun and confuse that enemy. So it's no longer weird that you could play Steel Fist when you are stunned, deal 5 damage to the enemy, and then clear your stun. It works the way you think it should. And Armor Up simply got changed to when the villain would activate, change to hero form. So that kind of gets around some of the weirdness with Armor Up. And Wolverine, they errated his alter ego text so that it said put Wolverine's claws into play instead of just search your deck or discard pile, whatever it said before. Now you're going to simply be putting them into play from the set aside that you did in step 1 of the setup. Berserker Barrage, similar to with the Steel Fist, they simply cleaned up the text so that it works the way it's meant to. They did change the Mojo Mania scenario pack, the Search for Spiral, that side quest where you can take damage to remove threat. They turned it into a cost, take 2 damage, cost, remove 3 threat from here. There were some implications with it not being a cost, but now it is. So if you can't take 2 damage, you can't choose to do this anymore because you have to pay that cost. So they simply cleaned that up. And finally, with the fetch quest, they changed the text a little bit to, it says, when defeated in player order, each player may search their deck for a card and play that card, ignoring its resource cost. They replaced the phrase for free, which was again kind of nebulous. Like, does that include any other additional costs? Like, could you play, say, What Doesn't Kill Me and ignore its cost of healing 2 damage if you wanted to for some reason? Now, instead of that, you're just ignoring its resource cost. You still have to pay any additional costs like exhausting a hero or whatever that would be. So those are the biggest things: the new targeting rules, the way defense works, the errata. A couple of the timing charts are nice. So I would say that's the main stuff you have to know. And also the big exception with being able to clear or stun or confuse without a valid target. Those are good to know as well. So now I'm just going to quickly run through the whole thing and look for any other items that might be of interest. I don't want to spend too much more time on this because this is me and this is already going long like it always does. But I'm going to try to find, there's a few other little nuggets in there I want to make sure we go over. Another big thing I definitely want to highlight is with the rules for a villain attack, where we have this section, attack enemy activation. It just goes through and very clearly, step by step, lays everything out in such a better way than it used to. I particularly like this step 3, where it tells you exactly how to do the boost cards, resolve each of the attacking enemy's boost cards one at a time, and in the order in which they were dealt by doing the following. So you're going to flip the boost card face up, resolve its boost abilities, increase their attack value by 1 for each boost card, discard the boost card, and then if it has more, you go through them one at a time. It was always a little confusing, like if you're playing Claw or Venom or somebody that has multiple boost cards, can I just flip them all up and see what they all are? Or, do I have to do them one at a time? You do have to do them one at a time in the order which they were dealt. And this tells you exactly how to handle them. You completely resolve one, then you discard it and you move on. It's just really nice that they've taken the time to just spread everything out and really give you a step-by-step description of how these things are supposed to work. Even has a rule here for if you have tough, but you use a basic defense that reduces the damage to 0, you do still get to keep your tough. We talked earlier about you can't protect tough with interrupt effects and things like that, but if you defend and don't take damage, you do still get to keep your tough. I like that we have a rule for when an enemy initiates an attack. They finally have the initiates language in the rules. You know how Spider-Man says when the villain initiates attack, but other times the cards will just say when the villain attacks. That timing has always been the same, but they weren't very clear. Sometimes they used the initiates language, sometimes they didn't. Now we have both in the rules, so we know that both of them occur at the same time. And there's a section over here. These rules also apply to enemy attacks. Interrupts that trigger when the villain attacks have the same timing as interrupts that trigger when the villain initiates an attack. So it's clearly spelled out. And it clearly spells out that it's after damage from the attack is dealt, is when abilities that trigger after an enemy attacks or after a character defends resolves. We have all kinds of effects that will say that after an enemy attacks, do such and such. And it was always, well, when is after? After is after the damage resolved. It's the same, and it's the same thing, or after a character defends, that is again after the damage resolves. So this is just clearly telling us all the timing. It points out if an enemy attack ends before damage is dealt, abilities that trigger after a character defends an attack resolve. So say you killed the enemy with a powerful punch, you still are considered to have defended it, but abilities that trigger after an enemy attacks do not. So if there was something that said after an enemy attacks, do this, but if you kill it before it finishes its attack, then it is not considered to have attacked. These are all very nitty gritty, and I wish I had examples to point out, but I would really have to dig through the whole card pool to find them. And the important thing is I'm just trying to draw your attention to these things in the rules reference so that when you have questions, you know that they are in here and you hopefully will be able to find where they are. Here's another example of the status effect exception I made sure to make a big deal out of earlier. It is in other places in the rulebook. A character can only initiate a basic attack if there is an enemy that can be attacked by that character or if that character is stunned. So being stunned or confused does create an interesting exception situation now that it didn't used to, as far as I know. Another thing that is spelled out very clearly here, and I'm not going to go through it all because it's kind of a lot to read, but we have a lot of effects now like warrior skill and aggressive energy that add damage to an event or add damage to an attack. And it sometimes can be very confusing. Does it add damage to every instance of that attack, or what if there's multiple attacks? It's all very clearly spelled out here in the attack player action section. It will tell you if it's an event with multiple attacks, how to handle that, or if it's an event with a single attack with multiple instances of damage like melee. It also explains clearly how to handle that. And that's something I always have to look up or ask because I always forget. Depending on the type of event, it is handled differently, but it is spelled out here. So I'll just quickly read it. When an attack ability has its damage increased by another ability, each instance of damage in that attack that does not use the word additional is increased by the specified amount. And that additional is, of course, referring to some effects say, do this much damage, and then flip some cards, and then do X additional damage equal to, you know, some icons revealed or something like Adam Warlock has cards like that. Iron Man has cards like that. And when it says additional, it's telling you to lump all that damage together. So that card is only doing one chunk of damage. And if you're going to boost that card's damage with something like warrior skill, it's only going to boost it by one because that additional damage is all grouped together. But again, if it's something like melee where it says deal 3 damage and then deal 3 damage again, those are separate instances of damage. Those can be boosted. And then there are cards like Black Widow's Dance of Death that says make the following 3 attacks and then deal 1 damage, deal 2 damage, deal 3 damage. Those are all separate attacks. And then those are increased separately. They are not all the instances of one attack. So when you're using effects like Warrior Skill, Aggressive Energy, and Biggin, anything that increases the amount of damage, or the same applies to thwart events if you're boosting the thwart, you have to be aware of if it's a single attack with multiple instances or if it's multiple attacks. And this section here will explain to you how to handle that. We have a section for when an ally is being attacked specifically. So there are things like in the Crossfire's crew modular encounter set, it'll say to attack the ally with the highest cost or something like that. And this explains how to handle that. Essentially, you can still defend for that ally if you want to, but if you don't, instead of the damage being undefended and going to your hero like it normally would, any undefended damage is going to go to the target of that attack. So if it is attacking a certain ally, the damage is going to go there. You can still handle the attack in all the normal ways pretty much, but it just kind of explains how that works because that's a new thing. One thing I'm glad they highlighted here in this section about boost abilities, it says damage dealt by a boost ability is not considered to be damage dealt by the activation during which the boost ability resolved. So when a boost effect deals damage, that is a separate thing from the villain dealing damage, and it doesn't count towards the villain having damaged you for various effects. Like Claw has that attachment that when he attacks and damages you, it stuns you. If the boost effect damaged you, that doesn't count as Claw damaging you for that effect, so you wouldn't be stunned. So it's nice that they have a separate line just for that. Again, you can read all of this. It's all very clear. I just want to call out some of the more interesting things. They introduced this concept of game element. There's a whole section we'll get to here in a little bit. In and of itself is just identifying all the things that are considered a game element for the purposes of their targeting, the language that they use on the cards. There's a whole section for how to handle when you're being given a choice. And when it's an encounter card, you have to choose something that you can at least partially fulfill. Same thing with confuse. A confused character can attempt to thwart or use a thwart ability, even if there are no schemes that can be thwarted. But again, only if you are clearing your status effect. So this section on damage is very pertinent these days. They decided to make a distinction between dealing damage and taking damage. So when, say, the villain attacks you and whatever damage they generate is how much damage they have dealt. But then you might, reduce that damage with something like a sidestep or an energy barrier. And so you will take less damage. But it specifies here when the amount of damage a character takes is modified, such as by damage being prevented, the amount of damage dealt is not modified. So when Green Goblin is attacking you with one of his treacheries and it says if he deals 3 or more damage, this card gains surge. Even if you prevent that damage and you didn't take the 3 or more damage, if he dealt 3 or more damage, he's still going to get that surge. The same thing applies to the Power Stone. As long as you're able to deal that damage, whether it's prevented or not, the Power Stone can change hands. So that one's a little bit weird. They changed the deal and take thing because there are some fun interactions where if you can prevent damage, that is like part of a cost. As long as that damage is being dealt, then you are not required to take the damage. So the example of Ms. Marvel, the Nova signature ally, it says that she needs to deal 1 damage to herself to then return a card to your hand. If you can prevent that damage, she can still do that effect because she doesn't have to take the damage. Take is required, deal is not. So I know it sounds really weird. It's all right here. So you'll be able to read it, but just know that there's a difference between dealing damage and taking damage, and sometimes it matters. There's a whole section now on each player. When each player is instructed to resolve an effect, each player resolves that effect one at a time. If it doesn't specify the order, the first player decides the order, so it doesn't necessarily have to go around the table. That may or may not matter. There's also rules for the double-sided cards. The card is double-sided, neither of its sides has a card back, so like your hero and alter ego. There's some villains that flip back and forth. A double-sided card would enter an out-of-play area other than the victory display or set-aside area. It is removed from the game. So essentially when you, say, flip down to alter ego, your hero side is considered to have been removed from the game. I guess we needed rules for that. That might matter here and there, I suppose, but if you ever need to know, there it is. One thing I like that they specified here in the end of player phase, and this could matter from time to time for sure, is it tells you exactly how to end the player phase. And in steps 4 and 5 here, they clarified any effects that last until the end of the player phase end first. So say you're getting +1 attack until the end of the phase. So until the end is up to a certain point. And then if there are any effects that resolve either when or after the phase ends, those happen after that. So just keep an eye on the wording if you ever need to know if you've got an effect that lasts until the end of the phase, but there's another effect that lasts when the phase ends. Here we have a chart that tells you which comes first. And here we have another description of when the amount of damage can be modified. Here in the event section, it says if an effect modifies the amount of damage an event deals or the amount of threat an event removes, and that event deals multiple instances of damage or removes multiple instances of threat, each of those instances is modified. So if you embiggen a melee or embiggen a multitasking, they both get boosted. But if an effect modifies the amount of damage an attack deals rather than an event, and I love that they put this in parentheses, they're explaining what they're telling you. They're showing you the difference between the previous. They just really wanted to make sure that you were able to read this and understand it. So if you have an effect that modifies the amount of damage an attack deals, and an event initiates multiple attacks, only the first of those attacks has its damage modified. So again, when you're playing Gambit and you've got a Royal Flush and you want to know how do I boost this with an aggressive energy, you'll be able to come look at the event rules or the attack rules, and you'll be able to see exactly how that's meant to be handled. We have a whole section for find now. When instructed to find a card, a player searches each game area where that card could be found. Play area, set aside area, player deck, discard pile, and counter deck. You know, that makes me think of Rogue's touched card. Her power tells you to find touched and set it aside at the beginning of the player phase. So no matter where it is, you're going to be able to find it. And this tells you all the different places you could look for it. Here in the forced section, they've kind of expanded upon this. Force is a bold trigger word. If the word force precedes a triggered ability, that ability's initiation is mandatory. If a forced ability requires one or more targets to resolve and it has no valid targets, it does not initiate. The one I've seen thrown around for this is She-Hulk's superhuman strength that says it gives her +2 to her attack, but it's a forced response that after you attack, you have to discard it, but then it stuns the attacked character. If that character is already stunned, then they are not a valid target for that effect, so you don't have to do it. Any costs that would have been paid to initiate the ability are not paid, so you don't have to discard it. You can't trigger it, so that just continues to stay in play. So there are times where that can be really cool. So this is where we really have to pay attention to the valid targets thing. Here we have this whole section about game element. So if you ever need to know what is considered an element of the game, you can come to this section here: cards, decks, discard pile, hands of cards, specifically, not your hands, hit point dials, players, and tokens. They have specified that when you're drawing up to your hand size, a player draws cards one at a time, checking after each card is drawn whether they're at their hand size. So things like Nova's the World Mind resource card that doesn't count against its hand limit. You know, you're drawing one at a time, so you would continue to draw if you drew one of those. And Star-Lord's helmet, if you were to deal yourself an encounter card while you were drawing your hand, you would end up getting an extra card, so that's nice. I like how here in the hazard icons section, they specify for each hazard icon on cards in play, deal one player one additional card, and in parentheses, not one card per player, because that is a common misconception that when there's a hazard in play, everybody gets an extra encounter card, but it is in fact only one person. Now, if there are two hazards in play, then the first player and the second player would get an additional card, or if you're playing solo, you would get both cards. But it's not one card per player per hazard, and they specify that very clearly here, which is nice. Here in the identity specific card, there is a note pointing out that identity cards are identity specific cards. That makes me think Ghost Spider. Some people question Ticket to the Multiverse, does that ready Ghost Spider? Because it says it readies all of her identity specific cards. And yes, Ghost Spider herself does count as an identity specific card. There's a useful section here under indirect damage. They have included this line: only the defending character or the attacked player's identity, if the attack was undefended, is considered to have been attacked, even if other characters were assigned some or all of the indirect damage. That could be pertinent if, say, you're fighting Sandman and he attacks you, all of his attack damage is indirect. But say you were to defend with an ally and then there was some indirect damage left over, you know, you can still spread it around however you want, but whoever you defend with is the only character that is considered to have been attacked. If maybe he had an attachment or something that did something, you know, when this character attacks and damages somebody, it only matters for the one person who defended, even if the indirect damage got spread around. They've added a lot of extra text to the interrupt section, so if you find those problematic, then you should be able to find everything you need to know about them there, when they can be triggered, how often, things like that. One thing that's nice here under keywords, if a card gains multiple instances of a keyword, any additional instances have no effect unless that keyword is followed by a number. So if something has surge and it were to somehow gain surge again, it wouldn't gain surge 2 because it doesn't already have a number. Whereas if something had Retaliate 1 and it was granted another instance of Retaliate, it would just become Retaliate 2. So if it doesn't have a number, it can't get it again. If it does have a number, it can. We have a nice section here for look or looked at that they have expanded. While a player is looking at cards in a deck, those cards are still considered part of that deck. Where that can be interesting is, say you're playing Scarlet Witch and you're using Agatha Harkness to look at the top 3 cards and choose to add one to your hand. You're just looking at those cards. So say those were the last 3 cards in the deck. When you pick those up to look at them, the deck is not considered empty at that point, because those cards are still considered part of that deck. So you haven't emptied the deck simply by looking at the cards. You can still look at them, fulfill that effect. And then after looking at cards in a deck, those cards are returned to that deck in the same order. Now, I think in Agatha's case, she tells you what to do with them. But, if you're told to look at cards, then they just go back. If you're told to search, that's when you shuffle. But if you simply look, they go back in the same order. But it doesn't empty the deck. You haven't removed those cards from the deck. We get a greatly expanded section about how to handle the main scheme, particularly when it advances. So that's useful. There is one section I'm not super sure about what it's referring to or how to handle it. If you look at the obligation, there's a new section that says if a player draws an obligation card from their player deck, they place that obligation into their play area. Now, I think that's mostly talking about if you're playing like the Red Skull campaign, that you might have obligations in your deck that you could draw. Maybe you took them to heal, I think is how that works. I don't always play the campaigns. But there's other ways obligations could end up in your deck. If you're playing against Mysterio, cards can end up in your deck and things like that. So if you end up with an obligation, this is telling you that if you draw an obligation from your player deck, you play it into your play area. And it says that you do not draw a card to replace the obligation unless you're refilling your hand to your hand size. So if you are drawing at the end of the turn and you end up with an obligation, that obligation is immediately meant to go into play. But there are, some obligations that are meant to be in your hand, like System Shock for the Mad Titan Shadow campaign. And what if you draw somebody else's obligation? I honestly don't know. I'm not sure if we know exactly what this is referring to yet. So if you know, feel free to leave it in the comments to help myself and others. But I'm not 100% sure why this is here, other than we didn't have rules before about how to handle if an obligation ended up in your deck, via something like Mysterio. This is telling you, obligation cards are typically put in your play area, but I'm still not 100% sure what this is referring to. So, but I wanted to point it out, so maybe you can tell me, or we can all figure it out eventually. We have a nice line here in the overkill section. Damage dealt by overkill to an identity or villain is considered damage from an attack, but does not constitute an attack against that character. You think of Kang has, I think it's called the future weapon, where it gives him +2 attack and overkill. And then it says, if this attack damages a character, that character is stunned. So that is considered damage from an attack. It does not an attack itself, but it is still considered damage from an attack. So sometimes the wording on that kind of stuff is just very particular. And it tells you how to handle when an ally or minion with a tough status card is dealt excess damage by an attack with the overkill keyword. Overkill damage is not dealt to the identity of that ally's controller or to the villain, because the tough, of course, prevents all the damage. Here we have a nice line in ownership and control. Upgrades attached to a card controlled by a player other than the upgrade's owner are controlled by that other player. So if you play an inspired on another player's ally, then that other player is now considered to control that inspired. So say they got a caught off guard, they would be allowed to discard that attachment that's on that ally, because now they control it. You're under player elimination. Now we know what happens if you were the first player and you get eliminated. You pass the first player token to the next player. You didn't have a rule for that before. So here in the prevent section, we have more about taking and dealing damage. And this stuff is going to be tricky, and we're just going to have to reference this every time we get in this situation. When an effect prevents damage dealt to a character, the amount of damage that character takes is reduced, but the amount of damage dealt is not reduced. If an effect prevents all damage dealt to a character, that character is not considered to have taken damage. And this one's fun. If all damage from an attack is prevented, the attacking character is considered to have dealt damage, but is not considered to have attacked and damaged the attacked character. That is an incredibly specific distinction to be made, but I'm sure there will be times where that will matter. If dealing damage is a cost, that cost is considered paid even if some or all of that damage is prevented, which is the main reason they did this. They wanted you to be able to be creative. If you have an effect that causes you to deal yourself damage and you have a way to prevent it or redirect it, they wanted you to still be able to interact with that. but we can see it had some other implications as well. But if taking damage is a cost, that cost is not considered paid unless all of that damage was taken. So whereas it does work with Ms. Marvel, the ally for Nova, because her ability says to deal herself 1 damage, if you're looking at Focused Rage from She-Hulk, it says to take 1 damage to draw a card. That damage must be taken because it uses the word take. So very, very specific on that stuff. We now have a section on requirements and how that part works. So if you need to look that up, there's now a section for it. They have added under the resource ability, a resource ability that generates a resource only for a specific type of cost cannot be triggered when paying a cost not of that type. You know, it makes you immediately think of War Machine's Gauntlet Gun. Technically, by the rules, the way they were written before, you could exhaust it to gain a ammo token, even if you weren't using it to pay for a War Machine event. That is no longer the case. Now we have a rule that clearly specifies that if a resource ability says it needs to be generated for a certain thing, it has to be generated for that certain thing. Similar to the interrupt section, we have a greatly expanded response section. So if you want to brush up on exactly how those work, we have a line under restricted that tells you that you can play or put into play a restricted card, even if you already control 2, and then you just have to discard down to 2. Before, we weren't sure if you were allowed to play a third one or not. You can, and then you just have to discard something. The section on retaliate has been greatly expanded, so you can see the timing of how things work with that if you ever have a question about it. And similar to the enemy attacks, the enemy schemes section has been greatly expanded to explain how the boost cards are meant to be handled and things like that. This part's nice. Under text box, they've added a line, icons printed within a card's text box are considered abilities within that text box. That's relevant to cards that blank things. I think I mentioned earlier, but the Vivian basic ally that can say to consider a text box blank. If there are icons in it, say you blank a side scheme and it has a crisis icon, that icon does get blanked. So that's good to know. We have a new section on timing. It doesn't tell you anything, but it tells you where you can go look to find out about timing. I find that amusing. They've expanded the tough section. A character with multiple tough status cards discards only 1 tough status card each time it would take damage. It's nice to have clarified. Tells you that you can reduce the damage with your defense to keep your tough. Now, there's an interesting line I saw in the treachery section that I hadn't realized. I don't know if this is a new rule or if this is a clarification. If a treachery causes 1 or more enemies to activate as its last effect, that treachery card is considered resolved and is discarded at the start of those activations. So I know we've always kind of wondered, you know, I draw and advance, and now the villain's going to scheme, but the deck is going to empty before, you know, I can deal myself the boost card, or, you know, however that works. When does the advance go to the discard pile? And we see now that the advance will go to the discard pile before the boost card is drawn, meaning it's much more likely for cards like Advance, Assault, Gang Up to get shuffled back into the encounter deck, because normally I would have thought they would stay in play until after the whole thing, you know, the whole activation is resolved, and then they would get discarded, because that's how treacheries are typically handled. But if it is a treachery that causes an activation specifically, then it immediately goes to the discard pile before that activation begins. We have a little bit of an expanded rules here on the unique icon. An ally without a subtitle cannot coexist with an ally that has a subtitle if those allies share the same title. So we have the Valkyrie Aggression ally and the Daredevil Protection ally. They don't have subtitles. I think the Valkyrie one just feels like an oversight, but the Daredevil one is thematic because the people in that universe don't actually know that character's name. But even though we don't know for sure that that is Matt Murdock, if there is another Daredevil in play that is Matt Murdock, you still can't have those together, even though they might not be the same person. They did make a rule for that, and you can't use the Valkyrie Aggression ally in the Valkyrie deck, even though she isn't necessarily Brigitte. We have the Victory X section is greatly expanded, so if you have questions about how cards go to the victory display, you can check there. This villain defeat section is much more interesting than it used to be. It talks about attachments and now upgrades, meaning mainly Cyclops' upgrades. Status cards, counters, and non-damage tokens on a villain carry over to the new stage. But if the new stage of the villain has a different title from the previous stage, then all that stuff does not carry over. So if you're fighting against Mansion Attack and you defeat Blob and out comes Pyro, Pyro doesn't get to keep all the stuff that was on Blob because he's a different person. But if you're fighting, you know, against, you know, if Loki switches out or any other villain, you defeat Zola Stage 2, go to Zola Stage 3. As long as they have the same name, They're going to keep all the same stuff, their status effects, any bonus attachments they have, any of Cyclops' upgrades, things like that. And it tells us if a villain is defeated while activating, the villain resumes that activation using the new villain stage. I think a lot of people assumed if you defeated a villain stage with, say, a powerful punch or something when they're attacking you, if you defeat them, then that just cancels that attack. But that is not the case. The villain just keeps on rolling through with its new stage. But again, if it's somebody new, Blob to Pyro, then that activation does end because it's a different person. So this case, the theme kind of wins out here. You can kind of just imagine that the villain is carrying on. Though the reason it's a little confusing is when you defeat, say, stage 1, you are considered to have defeated that villain for the purposes of playing a card like Chase Them Down or anything that triggers off defeating an enemy. So it does maybe feel a little weird that you have defeated the villain, but they continue to keep attacking you. But at least we have a rule in place that tells us that that is how that works. They've expanded the villain phase to clarify that in player order, each player resolves the following. The villain activates against the player. Each minion engaged with the player activates against them in the order of that player's choice. I think sometimes people have thought that all the villain does all their activations against all the players, and then all the minions do all their activations, but that is not the case. The villain activates, all your minions activate, then it goes to the next player. Here under the villainous section, this is nice. If a boost ability on a boost card dealt to a minion refers to the villain, that ability still applies to the villain, even though a minion is resolving it. There's times where you'll be fighting against a villainous minion and they'll draw a boost effect. And it's like, oh, I don't know. This says that the villain gets, +2 attack or something like that. That still only would apply to the villain. So you don't have to worry about trying to finagle like, well, is this meant to work for the villainous minion? If it says the villain, it means the villain. This is nice. When defeated abilities, we now know that a defeated card leaves play after its when defeated ability is resolved, if any. Sometimes it's a little confusing. There's some timing issues if say a side scheme leaves play and then it's when defeated ability triggers, or just depends with certain attachments like followed or various cards like that. It's hard to know the timing. Here you'll be able to check and see when exactly the defeated abilities trigger. So that is nice to know. Here in the wild resource section, we now know for sure that when a card generates a wild resource, if it's doubled, you get to choose for each of them. There was a brief time they had a ruling in place where if a card with wild was doubled, they both had to be the same. But now they can be different. So if you're trying to play the Spider-Man, Peter Parker ally with the power in all of us, you can choose to have both of those wilds be different icons for the purposes of meeting his resource requirements. Surprisingly, the U section did not get greatly expanded like it did last time. The only little bit they added, and this is still nice, that it says for abilities that trigger after the such and such enemy attacks you, U refers to the attacked player even if that player defended with an ally, because I'm pretty sure I said earlier, the enemies always attack you, the player, regardless of if you block with an ally. So good that that's in there. I'm just surprised that such a complicated section didn't need to get more complicated. I guess that's a good thing. Now in the player deck customization section, they did specify that the identity card and any cards with the permanent keyword are not counted as part of the 40 to 50 card minimum. So no more only putting 37 cards in a Spectrum deck. We now know those 3 cards do not count, and she still has to have 40 cards apart from those. Here in the FAQs, where it kind of specifies how you can't protect tough statuses with triggered abilities like interrupts, but it tells you the ways that you could potentially keep your tough. All right, there are a lot of questions in this FAQ that are new. I'll just leave you to read these if you want to just check out what they all do. There's some interesting clarifications here, particularly about Kitty Pryde's Nemesis set. If you don't know how they decided that the White Queen works, if you're confused about mutant protectors, there's a few things of note here that you might want to look into. And I think that is everything. Yeah, the rest is just the errata, and we already went through it. So that is everything worth knowing about the new rules reference 1.5. I think I probably glossed over a few things here and there. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to ask. Or if I misspoke or misunderstood what one of these things was trying to tell us, please correct me in the comments so that other people can benefit and I also can know. This is brand new and there are probably a few implications that we haven't come across yet, or at least I haven't. So this will be, the document going forward. I'm sure we'll still be learning things. There's still a few clarifications I'd love to see just on a couple things. But overall, I just want to say that I am super positive on this. I'm so grateful they went to this much trouble. This looks like it must have been a lot of work to clean all this up. And I imagine a lot of it's going to be in place for all the cool cards that are coming down the line. So just a big thanks to FFG and everyone that was involved in putting this together. It's such a blessing to this community that we have a company and a group of developers that cares enough about the game to put this much effort into it. You know, we gripe and grumble a lot about the rules, and sometimes rightly so. It can be a little frustrating when the rules aren't as clear as they should be. But I don't think a lot of other games get as much attention as this one does as far as trying to get these rules questions answered quickly. I hope we can look at this as a great thing, as a positive thing. And I just want to thank you so much for joining me. I hope this was helpful. And I look forward to seeing you next time we get up in game. Take care, folks. Bye bye.